Great. We're going live. Welcome back. It's just a few days from our previous forum, but the relevance of today could not wait any longer. And so, as I'm kind of kicking off on this kind of live episode of our forum, I'm very happy to kind of set you up for the content of today, and then introduce my fantastic speakers. So as you know, April is National Cancer Prevention and Early Detection Month. So we are right at the end of a month that is so critical in terms of the timing. And I guess a topic on cancer is always meaningful. I think we are in a genuine inflection point in terms of where AI is moving from a research tool to more of a clinical frontliner in cancer care. And today, the three guests that I have, which I am so privileged to have on the forum, we really help us to understand this a bit deeper. But each one of them kind of represents three distinct layers of that kind of transformations. The drug discovery engine, which I think is a critical part of the conversation where cancer and AI can be understood. There is the pathology platform where we try to really understand with the greatest precision, right? What we could have never imagined before. And then we have the human data infrastructure where we are seeing more and more people who are from the field, who are integrating technology to train it, and therefore to also make it much more amicable to the needs that we have. Joining me in this journey is Virginie, which is connecting from the Boston areas. Is working for Valo Health. Is Bahar, which is also connecting from the Greater Boston area, which is working for PathAI, and micro1 Director of Medical Research, which is Paola, that is connecting from Argentina. So I'm going to make sure that the question we're going to have are going to go, first of all, in getting to know the people behind the jobs, and then we'll try to go a bit deeper into this. So Virginie, I'm going to start from you. You have a fantastic profile, right? It's one of those profiles that make me understand why people like you are able to operate at the forefront. But how did you get to where you are? I guess none of us started with AI. We kind of integrate AI as we were kind of developing. So share maybe a brief journey of yours to whoever doesn't know your work yet. Then I'm going to do the same with Bahar, same with Paul, and then we'll go into the merit of the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark, and really excited to be here today and having that discussion. So my background is in cell and molecular biology, understanding physiology versus pathology in disease. And really how I came to AI is understanding that we have an overwhelming number of data being generated. And as a biologist, I couldn't tap into it that much. And so I started to look into opportunities to collaborate with data scientists in my previous job at MD Anderson, with the goal to really enrich how we are doing things, to better understand the patient data, to extract some meaningful insights for our research, and finally to really kind of push medicines forward. And I had the opportunity to join Valo Health, where really during the pandemic, when really it was that point in time where AI was emerging more and more, and Valo had really a great narrative around, unraveling the complexity of diseases by leveraging, multimodal patient data in addition to advanced and analytical tools, including AI. And it got me very excited to really, collaborate with data scientists and people from various backgrounds in data science, biologists and drug discovery scientists and epidemiologists to really push this forward across disease areas. So I've been working in different disease areas so far. And, a lot of the things that we've learned were really applicable across diseases. So excited to be discussing cancer today.
That's great, Virginie. Thanks so much. I appreciate you being with us today, and welcome again right to the forum. And welcome to you as well, Bahar. Same question. I'd love to know more about how you ended up there. What I noticed that we do have in common when you spent some time at Harvard, which is where I've been for 15 years now. And so kind of every time I see Harvard somewhere on the picture, I do feel there is a connection with people who became member of this community at one point in time and their journey. But please, over to you, Bahar. How did you join your current journey, if I may ask so?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is in biomedical engineering. Actually during my PhD, I focused mainly on neuroscience and neuroengineering, thinking about neurological disorders. And then toward the end of my education, I was very excited about application of science in driving translation and patient impact. That was where I joined a program in healthcare entrepreneurship that was meant to really understand the different forces that are shaping healthcare and shaping bringing new technology to healthcare, from regulatory reimbursement, as well as technology development. And that led me into identifying PathAI as the next part of my journey, where I joined as a translational scientist, very much thinking about how to bring precision medicine and precision diagnostic, leveraging pathology as a key part of patient journey, especially in oncology. I was servicing as a translational scientist to our biopharma partners. And then as the technology advanced and we moved more toward development of the diagnostics, I joined the product team. Working with pathologists, very similar to Virginie, working with pathologists, with biomedical data scientists, machine learning engineers, to really be able to build scalable products that are actual diagnostics, and we can impact patient journey early on during their diagnosis, leveraging power of pathology.
Wow, well, fantastic, Bahar. Thanks for this. I appreciate how you were able to look at your personal journey also as you're developing your career orientation, right? In what is currently, I think, also a combination of the work you do in the Path AI, which we're going to talk about. And last on the list, Paola, people might have seen you already from last week conversation. So I'll try to tweak my question on the introduction slightly different. How does a medical doctor and a technology coexist? Tell us your journey for people that might have seen you before or for those who have not met you yet.
So, I could say that from a very early age, I have known that I wanted to help people and that I wanted to be a doctor. I knew that since I was a very little kid. But then when I was more closer to senior in high school, I realized that I also loved the way that technology, it was very early days of technology, I'd say back then. I'd say that I love to see the way how technology was actually helping improve life and was actually building all of these amazing and innovative processes to make things better. And my vision back then was, well, if what I really enjoy about this is helping people and creating a meaningful impact, then why wouldn't I want to mix what I believe could be the copilot to enhancing this approach and this impact with healthcare? So that's when my journey began on actually starting the two of them, mixing them together. I remember when I was still in college, we're talking 2017. AI was literally just a bare concept, 2017, 2018. And I started playing around with the neural networks. I remember one of my first research around that time was using a convolutional neural network to identify patterns to diagnose the presence of masses in brain MRIs. And that's kind of when it clicked to me that the future of making healthcare more accessible to everyone and broadening out the horizons for outreach was powering healthcare through technology to just preserve and try to maintain the most precious things that we all have, which is life. And I'd say that's when it really, really, really clicked to me that the combination of these two is just such a powerful tool that could just help improve so much the future on this.
Yeah, and one thing, oh, that I think is important is like, while it is not necessarily uncommon that somebody becomes a chief economist, like in my case of an AI company, is becoming kind of different than new that somebody like you is becoming director of medical research for an AI company. I think this is really showing where the technology is opening up to so many different domains that we couldn't even envision before. So I really see this as great news, right? In terms of enhancing, society at large, which I'm happy to cover a bit deeper now with my first question to you, Virginie. So Virginie, one thing that when I was kind of doing my preliminary work on the work you're doing and the work that Valo Health is doing, and you kind of mentioned it briefly before when you were talking about in your introduction, right? You mentioned multimodal. And if I understand this correctly, the idea is that the way to understand the disease has been to some degree limited, right? There are a lot of different factors that you guys are taking into account, right? It's the lifestyle, the environmental factor, is basically how the cancer biology is unfolding in any given patient, right? So tell us, for people who are not familiar with that, right? And I know that you have this platform, the Opal platform, that is really integrating these layers in the analysis. So tell us, what is this multimodal kind of approach to cancer research, and what are kind of the discovery that now we can imagine possible that maybe we cannot think about before?
Yeah, so the way I'm thinking about the transition most recently in the context of cancer is really understanding the tumor, and people have done that very well. And so acquiring data on the tumor itself. And then now we are starting to uncover data or generate data to really uncover what else is influencing the patient resistance to treatment, their trajectory, and the fact that they will kind of progress at a different pace, having some side effects. I actually worked on some of those side effects in my previous role. And so it's really about understanding better the context outside, I think, of kind of the cancer itself. And those data could be variable, right? So at Valo, for example, we are leveraging EHR data, genetic data. So, your context, your genetic context is going to help dictate how you react, right? React to treatment and so forth. And then your environmental factors may be also kind of having proxymetrics of those. So think about, for example, your lifestyle triggering more inflammatory profile that will impact diseases in general, not just cancer. And one of the things that you see across all those disease of where aging is a big contributor, things such as exercise, inflammation, and the food you are eating, all of this do contribute, right? And so those are speaking of the context. And so what I'm excited about now is really the ability to generate data that are proxy metrics for your systems, if you will, whether it's the immune system or, kind of like your metabolism. And all of these are going to impact how you react to treatment and kind of your disease progression.
Wow. Virginia, again, I can imagine so many follow up on this. I'll try to go to Bahar now, but try to build my conversation with you in trying to understand more and more, right? What we basically see emerging as a new way of thinking about the disease and the integration of technology. And I think the example that you made about what Valo Health is doing, right, is a perfect example in that direction. So this is great. Bahar, look, I'm going to expand on this. Basically, it'll become a story that everybody can relate to as your companies are kind of converging, right, in this understanding of improving our ability to prevent and detect cancer. And so, in the context of your company, PathAI, if I understood this correctly, there's a major difference between how conventional pathologists would basically work and what the pathology would be able to review versus the work you guys have been doing, because I guess it's really similar to what we've been hearing before from Virginie, the ability to process millions of cells, right? And basically be able to run different kind of correlation, different kind of elements in the equation that you're running. So what is that you have come across that the AI is capable of detecting that maybe a conventional pathologist would not be able to? And on a personal level, my father was a pathologist, right? So I remember when I was growing up, I was always exposed to kind of the work he was doing. And so I have a particular affection to the idea of what a pathology does. And it's fascinating to see that now we are expanding this even more, to basically expand even more. So I'd love to know more about your take on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So as many people might know, pathology is such a key part of patient journey that initial diagnosis is being done with the pathology sample. So the more information we can bring at the point of diagnosis, the better we can ensure that the patients are matched with the right therapeutic, the right diagnosis, and like all of the patient journey that comes from there really lies in this initial diagnosis. And pathologists are absolutely extraordinary in terms of the skills and abilities that they have in being able to evaluate this sample and like really see trends and patterns. But the area that AI can empower them further is kind of quantification, enumeration, and like pattern detection at scale is something that AI is very much powered in order to be able to leverage these multimodal data, leverage kind of pattern across patients, and be able to be very precise and very kind of reproducible. That's an area that we've seen. There's a lot of inter-observer variability with pathologies. So that's the area that AI is making the most impact, is being able to bring the insights to the pathologist and enhance the amount of information that they have in the initial diagnosis that they're making, as well as kind of automating a lot of parts of the workflow that are very manual right now and takes a lot of the bandwidth from the pathologist to kind of like free them to very much focus on the edge case detections in integrating this information all together and make sure that they're able to identify the right pathway for patient. If I'm to like kind of like expand on this, there are many biomarkers which are detectable from the pathology sample that there's a lot of research about them. But the challenge is we really cannot have pathologists reproducibly do this patient after patient and between different pathologies, and that has limited their clinical adoption. That's where AI is basically playing a major role in bringing it into clinical practice.
Wow. Thanks for this, Bahar. Really appreciate that. And so let me try to bring it down to the human data infrastructure, Paola, right? Now, you're running a unit, the micro1, where we're basically hiring people to help us integrate AI by training the AI, right? From a point of knowledge, right? And in some content, they used to be considered expert annotators. I think human data infrastructure is probably a better way to refer to this. So when it's specific to human data training and cancer, what are you particularly looking for, right? When you're basically dealing with the training of the people that you're basically responsible for across the many experts that you've been overseeing in your role. So help us understand how kind of the work that Valo Health and PathAI do in the industry is become relevant to you when you're basically training people that now are training the AI, right? So I'd love to have your 2 cents on this.
Sure. So this is definitely a great question because it is different in every single specialty, right? So when we're talking about bringing oncologists or even radiologists into a training task, I would say that the first question I usually push into the team is, what are we actually trying to capture, right? Because the default wording of just label this image almost always will end up missing the point. A radiologist could read a mammogram and that wouldn't really be classifying anything. They're just weighting prior films that they've seen. They're taking into consideration the density of the breast, family history, image quality, internal sense of how this case could compare to thousands of others that they've seen in the past. So with all of this expertise that they're evaluating when they have an image in front of them, a label that they add to it is just the very, very tip of the iceberg, you know? So if you only ask for the tip of the iceberg, which would be just give me a direct label of what you see here, you get a model
Mhm.
that gets very, very good at mimicking that conclusion, but not really the reasoning underneath.
So that could definitely look great on a clean test set and would definitely fall apart when it gets to deployment and when it gets to face those actual images that really matter, where you see ambiguity, you see atypical cases, where sometimes even the right answer is, I think I need more context to this, right? So
Hmm.
what we do is we really try to pull apart the layers of this and we ask for everything. We ask for the goal, of course, which would be the final diagnosis impression, for example. But we also ask for honest probability that they defend when looking at this, what else they considered when looking at this the differential diagnosis, what have you ruled out before getting into the final decision, and why, of course, why did you rule that out? What specifically, basically, what specifically drove the final judgment to provide that last label, which would be, as I said, the very, very tip of the iceberg. So, all of these processes that I'm mentioning, none of this is actually exotic. It's how every
Hmm.
single clinician, I believe, are trained to think. They are trained to get all of the pool of information that they've had from not only the image, but everything that's underneath that. Human body 2 + 2 is never four. And I love to say that always, just to open the mind of the people that are maybe outside of the healthcare space, that the human body is just so complex that there's never one immediate binary answer to what you may see in
Hmm.
front. So
Hmm.
I say that that's why clinicians are trained to think this way. And it's honestly quite rare in AI pipelines to consider all of this because one, the data could get messy because there's just
Yep.
so much considerations to craft into it. And two, it just could be more expensive to actually put in all of this deeper thought. But of course, it is the best practice to go at it. And
Hmm.
the bigger point that I'm trying to reach here is that the expert judgment isn't just one thing that you just extract from a clinician, like I say, one just simple label, but it's a process that has several parts and all of the engineering that it takes on figuring out which of these parts the model actually needs to learn and build something on top of, right? So you get that wrong, you get that process wrong, and I believe that you could end up building a very, very confident pattern matcher model that has no
Hmm.
sense of doubt, which could end up being quite dangerous too. And in medicine, honestly, the doubt is often, I would say more often than not, it's a very, very important part of this whole diagnosis process. So we really try to capture all of that into the reasoning once we are in front of a group of experts that we're training to work on human data initiatives that are for, let's say, impressive diagnosis approaches or possible suggestions for treatment or any of the other possible routes in this space.
Right, great, fantastic. So basically, Virginie, Bahar, and Paola, you have helped me to get a sense about the flavor of the urgency that are currently driving your agendas by understanding really specifically where your focus these days is going in your respective organization. And this is great. So allow me to go maybe to the next level, right? And not necessarily deeper or wider, just a different level. Virgin, I'm going to start from you, from something that I found out when I was kind of preparing for this. I think you, in your work, you flagged the idea that biomarkers, they are inherently limited. And if I understood that correctly, sometime when you're having a panel of biomarkers that we determine as what we want to see, you end up seeing what you want to see, but you cannot see what you cannot see, right? So you're kind of missing some elements, right? Which is so fascinating. It's equally quite paradigm shifting in this case. What is that your company is? I read that your company is trying to close this gap, right, between our conventional assumption about biomarkers and how AI can help us to see things that maybe we are not even looking for, right? So help us understand this because it's such an interesting part of, I think, the work you're doing.
Yeah, so biomarkers were originally, when you think about biomarkers, you think about molecular, proteins that are in the blood, for instance, that are increasing in the context of the disease or in the tumor in that instance. But biomarkers are more than that. And so they could be, patient features, and those could be we have those patients that do have this pro-inflammatory phenotype, and those are the ones that are going to be progressing faster in the disease. And so I guess, it did expand a little bit my view as a drug discovery scientist. So when I think about biomarkers, I think that I need to evaluate if my target is engaged, meaning that the drug is doing what is expected to do. It means that I'm going to have a set of molecular biomarkers that I take maybe from the blood or here the tumor in order for me to select the right patients to give the drug. But then, the expansion of that, view is really thinking about, again, those systems and like how your body is working and expand really in, a series and a suite and a signature of biomarkers that may characterize the patient, not only in their response to the disease today or the treatment today, but also during that progression and really capture the patient journey, right? And so it's prediction of using all this, amount of data we can generate and biomarkers we can generate, and not just a single or a couple biomarkers that really we use and leverage to understand disease trajectory and patient journey and trying to predict them. So I think this is really what the differentiator is, kind of in how we have this paradigm shift in biomarkers and where we are trying to bridge the gap. So we need richer data on the patients themselves. I think this is kind of like my conclusion is to really understand a given patient trajectory. We need to have more context outside of their disease.
Great. And I think, Virginie, it's almost like a perfect leeway into a question I have for you, Bahar, that is actually on the same of biomarker, right? Because if I understand this correctly, from the perspective of PathAI, right? You could have basically a shift towards pathology-based biomarkers, which basically means that we could predict cancer that maybe to a conventional pathology might look normal. So help us understand. This is a beautiful connection between the work that Virginie is doing at Valo Health and the work you're doing at PathAI, right? Because I think it's helping everybody who's watching us to understand this is not just about just the enhancement of the work that the medical staff is doing. Is also an expansion of the horizons, right? And basically the ability for us to see the peripheral view of what we were considering to be possible before. So yeah, help me understand that part, Bahar, please.
Yeah, so I think like that's a key part of how pathology can be augmenting humans' ability and pathology's ability of making the right diagnosis. One of the big ways around this is essentially trying to see if the multimodal biomarkers that you are finding can correspond to certain pattern in the tumor morphology and the tumor microenvironment that you're able to identify from the pathology sample, so that you can kind of like to say like identify the biomarker or simplify that biomarker into the tumor presentation that is presented, and be able to build models or systems or products that are reliably identifying this pattern and helping you to differentiate between different patients that might be responder to certain types of therapy or certain combination of therapies, taking into account both the immune system that is presented and how this immune system is interacting with the tumor, as well as other alterations such as the molecular alterations or even environment-based alterations that leads to the different presentation of the tumor morphology. So that's a role that the type of not futuristic, they're very close, but the type of next generation of digital pathology biomarkers and products are focused on is being able to distill down this information into patterns and representations that is in the tumor sample from the pathology side.
Wow. And it just, both of you, Virginie and Bahar, you just mentioned it's just like telling us what you do every single day. But I have to tell you, for somebody who is listening to you, this is such a breakthrough, right? Of what it could really become, right? The future of medicine. And I find this not only fascinating, but really humbling that we can witness this as part of what keeps you busy, right, on a daily basis. So there are tons of people who are working on this, and I appreciate that. Paul, over to you now. In basically going back to the space about training the AI through experts, which I think is almost like a stepping stone to what we also want company like PathAI and Valo Health to be able to do, right? But if I understand it correctly, in medicine, two very competent experts might come up with a diverging or disagreement, right, on the view. So there could be interpretation that humans make that don't necessarily give us a convergence on the diagnosis. They might have different way of interpreting a noise or a signal or the data point. And they might not be wrong. It's just that they might be coming from different point of view, right? Now, we understand it in real life to the point that in life, we have the idea that you can go and get a second opinion when you go see a doctor, right? But when you're training AI, how do you reconcile disagreements on data? Because I think one critical part for you is not only the training, but it's also eventually the scaling of the conversation of the data that you're training. So tell us how you're currently, at least in your head, if it hasn't happened yet, are you navigating this space?
Sure. So, I have heard a lot of the disagreement or on a data set as being taken or read into as noise, right? This is just an additional layer of white noise, or the noise is here, just needs to be reduced. Let's do an average. And I would very consistently push back on the idea that disagreement is noise, right?
Mhm.
Especially in oncology, because it is often most like the most useful signal in a data set when there is disagreement on a case. Resolving it through majority of vote, averaging the scoring, or just dismissing those that are differential to the main point of data, I would say would throw away information that it's really useful and that could really, really matter. As I've said this before in our previous panel too, when we're building systems that are user facing in the healthcare space, we are in a way actively participating in care. So that comes with a very big responsibility, and throwing away information that matters to reach a very robust final diagnosis, it's I would say a misservice to the users that are actually utilizing the platform. So we
Mhm.
can actually go a little bit deeper into this and go into an example. For example, the Gleason grading, this for pathology, in honor of our great panelists that are joining us today. Let's say that pathologists could agree on the very, very clear cases, right? Those are book outside, like coming out of the book directly. But maybe on those intermediate grades, agreement would definitely drop a lot, I'd say. So it isn't because the pathologists don't really know what they're looking at, but just like you said, the underlying biology, sometimes it's different, or their previous expertise says otherwise. So we can get, let's say, three pathologies that say that this could be a grade 3, and one that says it could be grade 4, or two that says it could be grade 4. Um, I wouldn't say that it's because they're wrong, or or that the disagreement would be cataloged as noise and should be just overlooked, because actually the disagreement is the diagnostic reality. Okay, smoothing it out doesn't make the case clearer. It just hides the fact that even the experts aren't 100% sure. So two things can go wrong when you just dismiss this. The first one
Mhm.
is that the model could learn to be confident in the exact same way that the experts aren't, or the opposite, which is what you want, what you really want to achieve, that those borderline cases, which are considered the more atypical ones, are the ones where a second opinion on a tumor board, if we go into the real life cases, would be involved, and that completely changed the way that the patient is treated, Or in this case, on the model, we add a very final human review stage due to this data signal. So we take something that is considered a disagreement, sometimes considered noise because it gets a little bit complicated, and we actually layered with a human in the loop to just increase I wouldn't say to completely get rid of the uncertainty, but increase the value that the user at the final end will be receiving, right? So I think that that should be the default, to be honest. If five pathologists look at a slide and three say that the slide indicates a grade 3 for the scale, one says grade 2, one says grade 4, like I said, that doesn't mean that the label is grade 3 is what I'm getting at. It's not an average. It's a very important signal that the model should not be confident at something that is uncertain, atypical, and very rare. So it should be an actual signal for a more heavily human in the loop involved that could have another additional layer of quality to verify what could really be helpful for the final user. Sometimes this higher trigger might be just signaling that it requires an additional study for more information, that information is missing, and the final outcome cannot be conclusive because there's not solid proof enough to give you a definitive diagnosis. That should be trigger and signal enough. Or sometimes it allows for a deeper evaluation, maybe go see this sub kind of a specialist rather than the one that you were seeing previously, to get a broader picture on what's going on. The model should be able to assess uncertainty the same way that a clinician would be able to, and admit when, just like you said, a second opinion or a broader board should be involved. In the case of a model, you cannot just go to a more experienced model to train it, right? So the trigger in here looks a little bit different. It's just a more emphasis on how important it is to take into consideration the complexity of the human expertise and know when to call for additional information rather than to confidently fail.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And you kind of give me a perfect way to engage with Virginie now, Paola, on drug discovery, Virginie, because I understand in the context of medicine. But if I understand drug discovery correctly, it does allow you to formulate multiple hypotheses that eventually you can investigate. So, in the context of the work you do in Valo, where do you find human judgment to be irreplaceable? Is there a circumstance where you are clear that this is really a complementarity between the technology that is generating more hypotheses, humans running experiments or running clinical trials? So help us understand the space of humans in the loop in the context of the work you're doing.
It's pretty heavy, I have to say still, right? I think the human expertise cannot replace what AI, can generate. AI is really good at seeing patterns, but I take those insights are as insights and they are helping us generate hypotheses that oftentimes we need to test, right? And we can test accuracy then, but it's never 100%. And I think it's really to accelerate. So the way I think about it is really ranking. And so imagine you have a series of compounds that you are generating. Now the AI is telling you, here are the top 10 that you need actually to screen further. You gain time. So this is kind of the same thing with hypothesis generation in the lab. AI can help you uncover biological insights that are really essential to say which cell type I'm going to test my drug on in order for me to understand which concentration I'm going to need to use in patients. Well, this is a question typically has been answered by testing multiple cell types. That could be a possibility. AI can tell you start with this one and then you can test it. So I think it's really also kind of speaking of the converging evidence that we can have to de-risk some of those AI generated insights or even using different computational tools. And really the human is there to receive all those different insights coming from different types of analysis. So we use a system of like converging evidence oftentimes at Valo. We anchor on causality for a lot of it. So using, for example, statistical genetics, we complement that with the patterns that we do see in humans, and all of that come together to, generate novel targets that we will then validate. And again, using human data. So it's really about the testable hypothesis to me and accelerating that process of discovery. I think the opportunity to have an AI doing it all, I think we're still very far from it.
That's great. I'm fascinated to do this. And as you were speaking, Virginia, I noticed that we already have a couple of questions that will keep us engaged maybe in the next round. And I wanted to have a follow up with you, Virginie, before going to Bahar and Paola, because there's a question that is involving both of you. Virginie, I understand now what you said in terms of the heavy involvement about human in the loop. There was a question that kind of Andrew asked before. I'll try to rephrase it the way Sydney helped me to rephrase it. There's also a lot of sensitive data, right? When you're working with this kind of models, right? There's a sense of privacy that sometimes it's normal in traditional system. It becomes ambiguous in digital systems. So how have you been navigating this space? I know this is a question I could ask to the three of you, right? I just start from you, just to understand when you, for example, somebody asks you, well, how are you dealing with the privacy that is coming with the data you're using for drug discovery, or when you are basically looking at human data? How have you been navigating this at the moment?
So oftentimes, people like us at Valo using human data, you don't access directly to patient data. So there's a system in place that make company like ours partner with hospitals or, people having the data sets where this is anonymized. So I mean, this is a safeguard that is, seen across the industry. So anything related to research, all the data sets we have access to, even though some of them are control access or publicly available, this is going to be anonymized. And so what you see is really kind of just insights coming from patients, but you cannot go back to the patient.
Great. Thanks so much, Virginie. Bahar, look, there's a question from Arshajit, if I pronounce it correctly, that is kind of split between one side of the question to you, one side of the question to Paola, right? And I'll try to formalize to engage in both of you. It's a question actually I wanted to ask you myself as well, Bahar, but I'm happy that it's coming from the participants. So a pathologist with AI, a pathology without AI, right? We could phrase this question about how is the role of pathologists changing? And it's similar. Last week, we've been talking about radiologists, and same question came up. Help us to understand how you're navigating this space, because I think it's really about not necessarily replacing, but really expanding the capabilities, right? And then I'm going to go to Paul afterwards. So, Bahar.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you covered this, and I've mentioned this multiple times of like really the role of AI in pathology, very similar to honestly our adoption of a lot of the LLMs is augmentation of the human expertise and allowing human to spend their time mainly in the areas that they have the expertise and they have the differentiation, and kind of like automating the parts that are prone to biases in judgment or are not necessarily tasks that we are like are kind of like sensory processing systems are not best organized to do that. One of the examples in pathologies is this biomarker quantification. That's very simple example of that is you have a staining, you want to count how many of the tumor cells are presenting this staining. This is a very simple task for an AI tool, but for a pathologist and for like a human eye, that's an approximation that can change a lot. And in context of like kind of targeted therapies, you generally have a cutoff of like if you're about 50%, you would qualify for certain medication, then a lot of human biases might come into the counting that you are doing. AI enables you to like do that quantification reliably, scalably, and then take your judgment based on the output that you are getting, which is like without bias and like much more objective to decide what should be the path for the patient. And kind of similar to what Paola was mentioning around the kind of like some of the uncertainties and like this probabilistic thinking, AI is very well positioned to bring that to practice because that has been one of the hardest things. There is a lot of biomarkers, there is a lot of like kind of like probability-based classifications that you want to have in your diagnosis, but that's not something that you can train pathologists to do reliably, whereas you can train AI to do reliably and then let the interpretation to be on the part of pathologists. So it's like making it much more objective in the places that it can be objective and giving more information to the humans to make that subjective decision making in the places that they are best trained with the skill sets that they have.
That's great. Fantastic. Thanks for this, Bahar. Paul, I'm going to try to go to you by taking the second part of the first question, or the question that came before. I kind of phrase it slightly different, right? When you were talking about the fact that the efficiency of a model will eventually determine the involvement of humans, this is something where in the post-deployment, we understand. But when you're assessing this in terms of the pre-deployment, what is your kind of your approach in terms of how much of human expertise is required versus how much of automation is basically running? So I guess it's where in other circumstances, people will imagine the post-deployment determines basically the validity of the model, but you're equally running a team that are training model before they are deployed. So help me understand that part of your job.
Sure. So I could present it in two ways. The first thing is, how do we assess the level of involvement of humans while training, correct? One very, very good thing that we do is we treat physicians and clinicians not really only as annotators, but as collaborators in the process. As I said, they're not just an additional layer that comes afterwards, they're part of the infrastructure. So all of the work around it deeply respects their expertise, right? And that's why the quality holds, because the expertise is respected as a core foundation of what is being built rather than as an afterthought. So that is one thing on how I believe it's the best way to address the how involved should human beings in this process. But I'd say it's not only when they're actually, let's say, labeling the images or doing the annotations or the actual work. No, this infrastructure starts even before the actual work is being done. It starts for when you're recruiting, when you're vetting the credentials, the subspecialty feeds, the subspecialties that need to be involved, the kind of degree that they need to have, and how you validate which expertise is better for which process. Because, for example, if we're looking at a very generic anatomical figure and we're trying to identify if the liver should be in the left or the right side of the abdomen, you could use a more generalist kind of approach of expertise. But now, if you are wanting to delimit the margins of a very specific resection of a tumor, then you definitely want to focus that out, the expertise on a subspecialty and an oncology surgeon that could actually tell you from the well-known domain how this is done. So it's just weighing the possibilities on the kind of expertise that needs to be involved in every single step, but it needs to be as part of the infrastructure since the moment that you recruit to the moment that the work is done to the moment that quality checks are being done. For example, you could have great expertise at the moment of annotating the work and the data, but then when it comes to the quality checks pre-deployment, which is getting to the second part of your question, if you use, for example, a mechanical engineer to run the fact check of a data set that is pre-deployment for production, they will not really be able to validate the content. Maybe they're able to validate the engineering behind it, how the patterns are being identified, the dimensions of the images, all of this. But you're not quality checking the actual data set that's going to be facing the user. So, but now, if you want to validate how the data is ingested on the format that it should be presented, then yes, you don't need a medical doctor to participate in that part of the algorithm. So it's mostly on recognizing and valuing the expertise that each of these teams have and placing them in the places where their collaboration is the most valuable. So I'd say it's very involved in every single step of the way without taking away from the great system that we're building. Something
Yeah.
that we'd always like to say is that the future honestly is autonomous and that it belongs to everyone because we're the ones building that together. So
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
think
that
that's
is
how.
it's a fantastic way, Palati, to actually also position this in terms of how can we kind of wrap up, right, the insight that we're sharing. And Virginia, Bahar, if that's okay with you, and if I can ask you a short answer to the last question I'll ask to the two of you, right? It's coming from kind of Stephen. I'll phrase it slightly different, but I'll try to keep the core of it. A lot of the work you do is phenomenal. But there is clearly a social and cultural dimension that has to follow, right? For this to become basically more and more reality. When you're dealing with people who are at the forefront of this, they have already seen the benefits. So they have been already culturally assimilated to the potential. But I'm sure you're dealing with tons of people every single day that start from scratch. They're not there yet. So how do you see the cultural adoption of this new way of thinking about medicine in your line of work? Are you more techno optimist these days, more techno pessimist? Give me a final comment on this, and then I'll try to wrap it up. I know we are at time. Virginie.
Such an interesting question. To me, I think it comes with a lot of fears, right? And I would say as much as an expert or as people working in that field closely with data scientists and AI tools, we see so much the limitations, right? We see the promises, but we also see the limitations. And so I think, I would say from our point of view, this is something that is at the surface, and we see the really kind of the potential of developing better medicines faster, right? And I think we really focus on that mission and overcoming some of the limitations that we face as, as a drug discovery scientist, and trying to overcome, like, I cannot drug this, I cannot find the right patient population. Those are the things that do excite us, right? It's really at the end serving the patients.
Great. Bahar, over to you. Same kind of question.
Yeah, if I'm to kind of like add to what Virginie said, I think like the biggest part of the adoption comes from solving a real challenge in the workflow and a real unmet need. Whenever that's the case, that has been like even the case if we look at our own use cases of like LLMs, nobody liked having to proofread those long messages and structure them, and the LLMs giving us access to that tool, that was the main thing that pushed it forward. Is that the best use case for the LLMs and AI? Probably not, but that was the most accessible. And that's the same thing that we are seeing in like adoption of the healthcare AI. It's very much focused on like what part of the challenges I have day to day are you solving? That drives the first series of adoption. And then that opens the gate for us to like build more complicated and more sophisticated tools that opens up possibilities that wasn't possible before. So that has been like really the area that we've seen is like it's not only about the best use cases and the new use cases that we are building, it's also about like the most kind of like challenging workflow solutions that we are building.
Well, Virginie, Bahar, and Paola, April, as I started, is National Cancer Prevention and Early Detection Month. And so after a bit close to an hour together, I am much more optimistic about the work that we're doing because there are people like you who are at the forefront of this conversation. So I really appreciate, first of all, I appreciate your time. I appreciate even more the dedication you have into bring this to the next level, right? And I know that is implicit that the success in your job naturally happens by the expansion of this research to millions of people that benefit from the ability of having technology eventually eradicating cancer, which is, I think, what we want to live long enough to see. I really very thankful for the time you've taken at the very beginning of the week. Happy to have met you. I am happy that we're not necessarily too far geographically, at least with you, Virginie and Bahar. And so maybe some other time where another event will be together. Paul, I'm happy that you are a colleague of micro1 and that there is more and more opportunity for us to integrate the work we're doing, the micro1 by exposing kind of the medical research and the unity you're leading. Again, once more, thank you. This will become a YouTube. We had great attendance questions, and I look forward to more interaction. And congratulations to all of you for the work you're doing. It's incredible to see three talented women like yourself bringing this conversation to the next level. So for Mark, thank you very much. And guys, have a great the rest of the day. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.